You're not qualified to even touch that radio." Captain Jake Morrison sneered as he blocked Cassandra Cass Reynolds from the control tower equipment at Ridgefield Regional Airport. The towering air traffic controller's massive frame cast a shadow over the 34-year-old woman in the faded maintenance coveralls, her grease-stained hands still clutching the emergency frequency scanner she'd been monitoring. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "Ma'am, please step away from the communications equipment," Morrison continued, his voice dripping with condescension as a small crowd of airport personnel gathered behind him. "This is a restricted area for certified personnel only. You belong in the hangar with the other mechanics, not up here where real aviation professionals work." The control tower erupted in nervous laughter as Morrison gestured dismissively toward Cass, who stood motionless near the radio console. Static crackled from the emergency scanner in her weathered hands. An F-22 Raptor somewhere over the Colorado Rockies was broadcasting a mayday call that had sent the entire tower into panic mode just minutes earlier. "Seriously, who let the grease monkey up here?" laughed Janet Pierce, the senior flight coordinator, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her coffee mug. "This isn't a place for pretend pilots. We've got a real emergency happening." Cass said nothing, her steel-gray eyes fixed on the radar screen showing a rapidly descending blip over the mountainous terrain of Elk Ridge National Forest. For just a moment, her calloused fingers traced the worn fabric of her coveralls, revealing a barely visible outline underneath, something rectangular and metallic hanging from a chain around her neck, hidden beneath the industrial uniform. The emergency scanner crackled again with the desperate voice of Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Ghost Patterson from the crippled F-22. "Mayday. Mayday, Ridgefield Tower. Complete hydraulic failure. Engines failing. Attempting emergency landing. Need immediate vector to nearest suitable runway. I'm going down hard in approximately 8 minutes." Morrison fumbled with the radio controls, his face flushing red as multiple frequencies buzzed with confused chatter. Ghost, this is Ridgefield Tower. We're working on finding you the best option. Stand by." The control room descended into barely controlled chaos. Morrison's hands shook as he tried to coordinate with Denver Air Traffic Control, while other controllers scrambled through flight manuals and emergency protocols they rarely had to use. In the corner, the airport manager, Frank Kellerman, paced frantically while barking orders into his cell phone about media coverage and insurance liability. "The closest military base is Peterson Air Force Base, but that's over 200 miles, Pierce called out, her earlier smugness replaced by genuine panic. "He'll never make it with failing engines. The commercial strips at Grand Junction and Colorado Springs are too far east. What about emergency landing strips?" Morrison asked desperately, sweat beading on his forehead as he watched the F-22's altitude continue dropping on radar. "Nothing rated for that kind of aircraft," someone called from across the room. "An F-22 needs at least 8,000 feet of runway, and most of our smaller strips are 5,000 feet max." As the panic intensified around her, Cass quietly moved closer to the radio console, her trained eyes scanning the topographical charts spread across the control desk. She knew these mountains like the back of her hand, every ridge, every valley, every abandoned World War II training strip that most people had forgotten existed. "He could try Silverton Municipal," suggested one of the junior controllers, "but that runway's only 6,200 feet, and it's got a 12-degree approach slope. Way too steep for a fighter jet. Plus it's surrounded by 14,000-foot peaks," Morrison added grimly. One miscalculation and he's scattered across the mountainside. The radio crackled again, Ghost's voice now strained with the effort of controlling his dying aircraft. "Ridgefield. I'm at 15,000 feet and falling fast. Engines are completely gone, running on backup power only. I need options now, or I'm punching out over populated areas. That's when Cass spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the chaos with surprising authority. Cascade Valley Strip, runway 0927, 9,500 feet, concrete surface, recently resurfaced. It's 47 miles northwest, bearing 315 degrees from his current position. The control room fell silent. Morrison whirled around, his face twisted with anger and disbelief. "Excuse me? Did the janitor just try to give flight instructions?" "I'm not a janitor," Cass said quietly, her eyes never leaving the radar screen. "And Cascade Valley is his best shot. It's an old military training facility, built for heavy aircraft operations during the Cold War. The approach is clear. No obstacles, and there's a 3,000-foot overrun area on both ends." "Lady, I don't know what you think you know about aviation," Morrison snarled, "but this is a life-or-death situation. We don't have time for mechanics to play air traffic controller." Pierce joined in, her voice sharp with authority. "Security! Someone get this woman out of here before she causes more problems. We have a real pilot's life at stake." As two security guards moved toward her, Cass's hand unconsciously moved to the hidden chain around her neck. For just a moment, a flash of something metallic caught the fluorescent light wings, perhaps, or some kind of insignia before disappearing back beneath her coveralls. The radio erupted with Ghost's increasingly desperate voice. "Ridgefield Tower. I'm at 12,000 feet and dropping like a stone. I need vectors now, or I'm ejecting in 60 seconds. There are hiking trails and campsites all through these mountains. I can't risk civilian casualties." Morrison grabbed the radio microphone, his voice cracking under pressure. "Ghost, we're still calculating options. Can you maintain altitude for another few minutes?" "Negative, Ridgefield. This bird is done flying. I'm pulling the ejection handles in 30 seconds, unless you can give me somewhere to put this thing down." The control room held its collective breath as Morrison stared at the radio, paralyzed by the weight of responsibility. In 30 seconds, a $150 million aircraft would be scattered across the Colorado wilderness, and possibly an elite pilot along with it. That's when Cass stepped forward, her weathered hand reaching for the microphone with a confidence that seemed to transform the air around her. They had just dismissed the wrong woman. Asterisk in the mountains of Colorado. An F-22 Raptor was falling from the sky, and the only person who could save it was a woman they'd all written off as just another mechanic. But sometimes, the most extraordinary people hide in the most ordinary places. And sometimes, a decade of silence is broken by the sound of a pilot in distress. Asterisk preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wonder where you're watching this story unfold from today. Perhaps you're sitting in your office, thinking about that quiet colleague everyone overlooks in meetings. Maybe you're a student who's felt invisible in your classes, or someone whose expertise has been dismissed because you don't fit the expected mold. Whether you're viewing this from a bustling city like Denver or Phoenix, or from a small mountain town tucked away in the Rockies, you've probably witnessed someone being underestimated before. You know that moment when assumptions are made based on appearance, job title, or gender, when someone's true capabilities are dismissed without a second thought. If you've ever worked in aviation, you know how hierarchical the industry can be. Air traffic controllers, pilots, and aviation professionals often operate in a world where credentials and certifications matter more than actual knowledge, where your position on the organizational chart determines whether people listen when you speak. But maybe you don't work in aviation at all. Maybe you're in tech, healthcare, education, or retail. Wherever your career has taken you, I bet you've seen it happen. That moment when someone in coveralls is ignored while someone in a uniform is automatically respected. When years of experience are dismissed because they don't come with the right title or the expected background. You've Probably been in situations where the person with the most knowledge isn't the one everyone's listening to, where the real expert is standing quietly in the corner while others with louder voices and fancier titles make decisions that could have serious consequences. And if you're a woman watching this, you might know this feeling even more intimately. You've likely experienced that moment when your expertise is questioned, not because of what you know, but because of who you are. When your technical knowledge is dismissed as luck, or when you're told you belong somewhere else, somewhere more appropriate for someone like you. The thing is, in America, we sometimes forget that extraordinary people walk among us every day, disguised as ordinary. The mechanic working on your car might have built race engines for NASCAR. Substitute teacher might have a PhD from MIT. The person cleaning the office might speak 5 languages fluently. And sometimes, just sometimes, the woman in grease-stained coveralls might know more about flying than everyone else in the room combined. But here's what makes this story different from all the others you might have heard. This isn't just about someone being underestimated because of their job or their appearance. This is about someone who made a conscious choice to disappear, to bury their identity so completely that even they sometimes forgot who they used to be. This is about a person who walked away from everything: the respect, the recognition, the career they'd fought so hard to build, and chose to live as someone else entirely. For over a decade. Until one desperate radio call changed everything. You see, there's a difference between being overlooked and choosing to hide. There's a difference between having your skills dismissed and actively concealing them from the world. And when someone has been living a lie for 10 years, when they've buried their true self so deep that it takes a life or death emergency to bring it to the surface, well, that's when you know you're about to witness something extraordinary. So wherever you are right now, whatever your own story of being underestimated might be, I want you to imagine what it would take to make you reveal your deepest secrets. What kind of emergency would force you to drop the mask you've been wearing and show the world who you really are? Because that's exactly what was about to happen in that control tower in Colorado. A woman who had spent 10 years perfecting the art of invisibility was about to remember what it felt like to be seen. And everyone who had dismissed her as just a mechanic was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous assumption you can make is thinking you know who someone really is. The F-22 was still falling. The pilot was still in mortal danger. And Cass Reynolds was about to make a choice that would shatter the carefully constructed life she'd built in the shadow of her former self. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, why her hand was trembling as she reached for that microphone, you need to know who Cassandra Reynolds used to be. And more importantly, you need to know why she'd spent 10 years making sure nobody would ever find out. Cassandra Reynolds lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Ridgefield, Colorado, in a complex called Mountain View Estates, though the only mountains you could see were through the gap between 2 industrial buildings if you stood on a chair in the kitchen. Her neighbors knew her as the quiet woman in Unit 14B who left for work at dawn and returned after sunset, her coveralls often stained with hydraulic fluid and engine oil. The apartment itself told the story of someone who had deliberately chosen simplicity over comfort. A single worn leather couch faced a small television that rarely got turned on. The kitchen table was bare, except for aviation maintenance manuals and technical journals, the kind of reading material that seemed oddly sophisticated for someone who supposedly just turned wrenches for a living. But it was the bedroom closet that held the most secrets. Behind a row of identical blue coveralls and flannel shirts, pushed far to the back where casual visitors would never see them, hung 3 items that told a different story entirely. A dress blue military uniform with captain's bars gleaming on the shoulders, a leather flight jacket so worn the patches were barely legible, and a garment bag containing something few people had ever seen in person: the desert tan flight suit of a Navy Top Gun graduate, hidden in a shoebox at the very back of the closet. Wrapped in tissue paper like precious artifacts were items that would have shocked anyone at Ridgefield Regional Airport. A pair of gold aviator wings, commendation medals from operations whose names were still classified, and photographs, dozens of them, showing a younger version of Cass standing beside F-18 Super Hornets, F-22 Raptors, and aircraft that most people only saw in movies. In those photographs, Captain Cassandra Phoenix Reynolds looked nothing like the woman who now fixed landing gear and changed engine oil at a small Colorado airport. Her hair had been regulation length, her posture military straight, her eyes bright with the confidence that came from being one of the best pilots in the United States Navy. The call sign, Phoenix, hadn't been given lightly. In her 8 years of active duty, Cass had earned a reputation as a pilot who could bring any aircraft home, no matter how badly damaged. She'd landed an F-18 with one engine completely gone after a bird strike over the Pacific. She'd guided a training aircraft to safety after a complete electrical failure left her flying blind through a thunderstorm. Other pilots said she had an almost supernatural ability to feel what an aircraft needed, to coax performance out of machines that should have been falling from the sky. The Navy had recognized her talent early. After completing flight school at the top of her class at Naval Air Station Pensacola, she'd been selected for the Elite Fighter Weapons School Top Gun at Naval Air Station Fallon. The training was brutal, designed to break all but the most exceptional pilots. Cass had not only survived, but graduated second in her class, earning the respect of instructors who rarely praised anyone. Her specialty had been air-to-air combat, but she'd cross-trained on everything the Navy flew. F-18 Super Hornets were her primary aircraft, but she was equally qualified on F-22 Raptors through a joint training program with the Air Force. She'd flown combat missions over Syria and Iraq, providing close air support for ground troops and establishing air superiority in contested airspace. By age 28, Captain Reynolds had been on track for promotion to major, with discussions about command positions and potentially attending the Naval War College. Her personnel file was filled with commendations from superior officers who described her as an exceptional aviator with unlimited potential and the finest pilot I've had the privilege to serve with in 23 years. Her apartment contained evidence of that life, carefully hidden but meticulously preserved. Flight logs showing over 2,000 hours in high-performance military aircraft, technical manuals for weapons systems that were classified at the highest levels, and correspondence from former squadron mates who still wondered what had happened to Phoenix Reynolds, the pilot who had simply vanished from the Navy one day without explanation. The transition from Captain Reynolds to Cass, the mechanic, hadn't been immediate or easy. For the first year after leaving the military, she'd tried to stay connected to aviation through civilian channels. She'd looked into commercial airline positions, corporate pilot jobs, even flight instructor roles at civilian training schools, but every application had required explanations she wasn't ready to give. Every interview had demanded details about why she'd left the Navy so abruptly, why someone with her qualifications wanted to step so far down the aviation hierarchy. The questions had been probing, sometimes suspicious, always requiring her to relive the circumstances that had driven her away from everything she'd ever wanted to be. Eventually, she'd stopped trying to fly and started fixing aircraft instead. Maintenance work let her stay close to the machines she loved without having to explain her background or face the scrutiny that came with being in command. She could lose herself in the mechanical complexity of engines and hydraulic systems, finding a different kind of satisfaction in making broken things work again. At Ridgefield Regional, she was known as one of the most skilled mechanics they'd ever employed, though her colleagues often joked about her unusual approach to troubleshooting. While other mechanics relied on diagnostic computers and service manuals, Cass seemed to diagnose problems by feel and sound, identifying engine issues that expensive equipment missed. "She's got magic hands," Jack Brennan, the head of maintenance, often told new employees. I've never seen anyone understand aircraft systems like she does. Sometimes, I think she knows those planes better than the pilots who fly them. What Jack didn't know was that Cass had once been responsible for pre-flight inspections on aircraft worth $100 million each, where a missed problem could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated potential failures, to spot problems before they became emergencies. Her coworkers had noticed other oddities too, though they attributed them to personal quirks rather than professional training. Cass always knew exactly what was happening in the air traffic control tower, could identify aircraft by their engine sounds long before they appeared on approach, and had an encyclopedic knowledge of airport operations that seemed excessive for someone who supposedly just worked on engines docked during her lunch breaks. She would sit outside the maintenance hangar and watch aircraft take off and land, her eyes tracking their approach angles and noting small variations in pilot technique. Other mechanics thought she was just enjoying the air show, but Cass was maintaining skills she hoped she'd never need to use again. She kept her pilot's license current through the minimum required flight hours, though she flew only small civilian aircraft at obscure airfields where nobody would recognize her or ask questions about her background. Those flights were bittersweet reminders of what she'd given up, but also the only time she felt truly alive. The apartment's spare bedroom had been converted into a workshop where Cass spent her evenings, not relaxing but studying. Aviation magazines, technical journals, and maintenance manuals covered every surface. She'd subscribed to publications that covered military aviation developments, though she told herself it was just professional curiosity rather than longing for her former life. On the walls, hidden behind generic landscape prints, were sectional charts of the entire Rocky Mountain region. Cass had memorized every airport, every emergency landing strip, every piece of terrain that might matter to a pilot in distress. It was a habit from her military days that she'd never been able to break, always knowing the landscape, always having an escape plan, always being prepared for the emergency that might never come. But emergencies, as Captain Cassandra Phoenix Reynolds had learned long ago, have a way of finding the people who are best prepared to handle them. And 10 years of hiding hadn't erased the instincts that had once made her one of the most respected pilots in the United States Navy. The mission briefing had been routine. Operation Desert Shield, a joint Navy-Air Force training exercise over the Nevada Test and Training Range. Captain Cassandra Phoenix Reynolds was leading a 4-ship formation of F-22's Super Hornets in a simulated air-to-ground strike mission, with her wingman Lieutenant Sarah Viper Shun flying alongside experienced pilots, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hawk Thompson and Lieutenant Jake Razor Williams. It was supposed to be a standard training run, the kind Phoenix had flown dozens of times before. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, and all aircraft had passed pre-flight inspections without any red flags. They were operating in restricted airspace, far from civilian traffic, with multiple safety observers monitoring from the ground. What nobody had anticipated was the catastrophic failure of the navigation system in Viper's aircraft. 40 minutes into the exercise, as the formation approached the simulated target area at 25,000 feet, Lieutenant Chun's F-18 suddenly broke formation without warning. Phoenix watched in horror as her wingman's aircraft entered an uncontrolled dive, plummeting toward the desert floor at a rate that would impact in less than 90 seconds. Viper Phoenix, pull up immediately. You're in an unrecoverable dive. Phoenix's voice crackled over the radio as she banked hard to follow her wingman's descent. The response that came back chilled her to the bone. Phoenix, all my instruments are dead. I'm flying blind up here. I can't tell which way is up. In that moment, Phoenix made the decision that would define the rest of her life. Instead of following standard protocol, which called for her to maintain safe distance and guide the distressed pilot through radio commands, she dove after Chun's aircraft, matching her rate of descent in a desperate attempt to provide visual reference. Viper, follow my aircraft. I'm directly to your right at your 10 o'clock position. Level your wings with mine." Phoenix's F-18 was now screaming through the thin air at nearly Mach 1, the desert rushing up to meet them with terrifying speed. For precious seconds, it seemed to work. Chun's aircraft began to level out, the nose coming up as she followed Phoenix's visual cues. They were at 8,000 feet and climbing when everything went wrong. Massive bird strike later, determined to be a golden eagle with a 6-foot wingspan impacted Phoenix's canopy at 400 miles per hour. The reinforced glass spiderwebbed instantly, completely obscuring her vision while hydraulic fluid from damaged systems began spraying into the cockpit. Her aircraft shuddered violently as multiple warning alarms filled her helmet. Blinded, and with her own aircraft now critically damaged, Phoenix faced an impossible choice. She could punch out immediately, using her ejection seat to escape the dying aircraft. It was the safe choice, the smart choice, the one that every regulation and training manual recommended. But ejecting meant abandoning Viper, who was still flying blind with no visual reference and no way to distinguish between sky and ground. Without Phoenix's aircraft to follow, Chun would almost certainly impact the desert floor at full speed. "Phoenix, eject! Eject now!" Hawk's voice screamed over the radio as he watched both aircraft plummeting toward the ground. "You're at 4,000 feet and falling." Instead, Phoenix made a decision that violated every safety protocol she'd ever learned. Flying completely by instrument while hydraulic fluid burned her eyes and made breathing difficult, she maintained formation with Chian's aircraft, continuing to provide radio guidance even as her own plane disintegrated around her. "Viper, pull back on the stick. Nose up, you're at 2,000 feet. Phoenix's voice remained steady despite the chaos in her cockpit, even as she prepared for an impact that seemed inevitable. Somehow, impossibly, they both made it. Chun managed to level her aircraft at 500 feet above the desert floor and successfully restarted her navigation systems. Phoenix, flying an F-18 that should have been unflyable, managed to nurse her crippled aircraft to an emergency landing at Nellis Air Force Base, touching down on foam-covered runway with no hydraulics and almost no forward visibility. The investigation that followed determined that Phoenix's actions had saved Lieutenant Chun's life. The bird strike that had nearly killed Phoenix was ruled an unavoidable accident, and her decision to maintain formation instead of ejecting was initially praised as heroic. But heroism, as Phoenix learned, sometimes comes with a price that isn't immediately apparent. Lieutenant Sarah Chun never flew again. The psychological trauma of nearly dying in an aircraft, combined with the knowledge that her squadron leader had risked her own life to save her, created a condition that military psychologists called survivor's guilt syndrome. Chun blamed herself for Phoenix's injuries' permanent damage to her left eye from the hydraulic fluid, chronic back pain from the violent ejection that had never happened, and nerve damage in her hands from gripping the controls during the emergency landing. More damaging than the physical injuries was what came next. The Navy's investigation, while officially praising Phoenix's actions, quietly began questioning her judgment. Had she followed proper procedure, both aircraft would have been lost, but the pilots would have survived via ejection. Her decision to risk 2 lives instead of losing one aircraft didn't fit neatly into the military's risk assessment protocols. The whispers started small but grew louder. Some senior officers suggested that Phoenix had been reckless, that she'd let personal attachment to her wingmen override sound tactical judgment. Others questioned whether the rescue had been worth the cost, not just the destroyed aircraft, but the psychological casualties that followed. The final blow came during Chun's medical retirement hearing. Testifying about the incident, the younger pilot broke down completely, sobbing as she described the guilt she felt over Phoenix's injuries. "She should have saved herself," Chun testified. "She should have let me crash instead of destroying her own life to save mine." That testimony, delivered in front of a review board that included Phoenix's commanding officers, changed everything. What had been framed as heroic suddenly looked like poor judgment. What had been celebrated as decisive leadership was reinterpreted as emotional decision-making that had cost the Navy 2 pilots instead of 1. The official reprimand was relatively mild, a letter of counseling that wouldn't prevent promotion but would forever remain in her personnel file. But the unofficial consequences were devastating. Phoenix found herself excluded from high-profile missions, passed over for advanced training opportunities, and subjected to psychological evaluations that questioned her fitness for command. The final humiliation came when she was assigned to a desk job at the Pentagon, analyzing flight safety reports instead of flying the missions she'd trained her entire adult life to perform. For a pilot who had lived to fly, who had found her identity in the cockpit of high-performance aircraft, the assignment was tantamount to professional death. Phoenix had entered the military to serve her country and had discovered a calling that defined every aspect of her identity. She'd excelled beyond her wildest dreams, earned the respect of peers and superiors alike, and built a career that promised decades of meaningful service. But in one moment of crisis, when faced with the choice between following regulations and saving a life, she'd chosen compassion over protocol. And that choice had cost her everything she'd worked to build. 6 months after the incident, Captain Cassandra Phoenix Reynolds submitted her resignation from the United States Navy. The official reason listed was personal circumstances, but everyone who mattered knew the truth. The Navy's most promising young pilot had been broken by a system that couldn't reconcile heroism with regulation, courage with consequences. The woman who walked away from Naval Air Station Oceana had been fundamentally changed by the experience. She'd learned that doing the right thing didn't always lead to the right outcome, that saving lives could destroy careers, and that sometimes the people you serve judge you more harshly than the enemies you fight. For 10 years, she'd carried that lesson with her, using it to justify a life lived in the shadows, telling herself that keeping her head down and avoiding attention was the smart choice, the safe choice, the only choice that made sense after everything she'd lost. But as she stood in that control tower, listening to another pilot face the same kind of life-or-death crisis that had once defined her career, Cassandra Reynolds was about to learn that some lessons are meant to be forgotten, and some prices are worth paying twice. The harassment at Ridgefield Regional Airport had started subtly, the way workplace discrimination often does, with small slights and casual dismissals that could easily be explained away as misunderstandings or personality conflicts. But over the 3 years since Cass had started working there, it had evolved into something far more systematic and deliberate. Captain Jake Morrison had set the tone from her very first week. As the senior air traffic controller and nephew of airport manager Frank Kellerman, Morrison wielded influence that extended far beyond the control tower. He'd made it clear from day one that he viewed the maintenance staff as second-class citizens, but his treatment of Cass carried an extra edge of contempt that seemed almost personal. "The grease monkey thinks she knows about aviation," he'd joke to other controllers whenever Cass offered technical insights during safety briefings. "Next thing you know, she'd be telling us how to fly planes." The comment stung because Morrison didn't know how close to the truth he was. But Cass had learned to swallow her pride, to let the expertise that had once commanded respect from admirals and generals go unacknowledged in a place where her opinions were dismissed before she even spoke them. Janet Pierce, the senior flight coordinator, had quickly picked up on Morrison's attitude and amplified it with her own brand of professional jealousy. Pierce had been trying to get her pilot's license for 6 years, failing the practical exam 3 times, and she seemed to take Cass's quiet confidence around aircraft as a personal insult. Someone needs to remind maintenance that their job is fixing things, not pretending to understand flight operations, Pierce would announce during staff meetings, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her clipboard as she spoke. We can't have people stepping outside their qualifications and creating safety issues. The irony was devastating for Cass, who had spent years ensuring flight safety at levels Pierce couldn't even comprehend. She'd conducted pre-flight inspections on aircraft that cost more than the entire Ridgefield regional budget, had written safety protocols that were now standard across multiple military installations, and had saved lives through her understanding of aviation systems that these people dismissed as just maintenance work. But the harassment wasn't limited to verbal slights. It had escalated into deliberate sabotage of her work and reputation. Morrison had started scheduling unnecessary emergency drills whenever Cass was working on critical repairs, forcing her to abandon complex maintenance procedures that couldn't be easily resumed. The interruptions often meant aircraft remained grounded longer than necessary, delays that were then blamed on her inefficiency. Pierce had gone further, filing formal complaints about Cass's unauthorized presence in operational areas of the airport. Never mind that maintenance personnel were required to access those areas to perform their duties. Pierce had convinced management that Cass was overstepping her boundaries, leading to restrictions that made her job significantly more difficult. She's always lurking around the control tower and runway areas. Pierce had written in one complaint that Cass had seen Coppet in her personnel file. Her behavior suggests someone who doesn't understand appropriate professional boundaries. This could create security and safety concerns. The accusation was particularly galling because Cass's presence in those areas was always work-related. Unlike other maintenance staff who completed tasks and moved on, Cass had developed a habit of observing flight operations with the trained eye of someone who understood the bigger picture. She'd spot potential problem, aircraft with slight engine irregularities, pilots who seemed fatigued or distracted, weather conditions that might affect safety, but her attempts to raise these concerns were consistently dismissed. The situation had worsened 6 months ago when a new hire, Tommy Rodriguez, had joined the maintenance team. Rodriguez was a recent aviation technology graduate, young and eager, but with limited practical experience. Morrison and Pierce had immediately embraced him as the kind of mechanic they preferred, deferential, impressed by their authority, and content to stay within narrowly defined boundaries. Finally, someone who knows their place, Morrison had announced when introducing Rodriguez to the control tower staff. Not like some people who think their job description includes giving advice to their betters. The favoritism was obvious and painful. Rodriguez was invited to safety meetings that Cass was excluded from. His suggestions, often less technically sound than Cass's, were met with enthusiasm and praise. When he made mistakes, they were treated as learning opportunities. When Cass raised concerns about his work, she was accused of being territorial and difficult to work with. The breaking point had begun building 2 months ago when Cass had discovered a serious problem with one of the airport's rescue vehicles. The fire suppression system had a faulty pressure regulator that could cause it to malfunction during an actual emergency. She documented the issue thoroughly, submitted a detailed repair request, and recommended immediate grounding of the vehicle until repairs could be completed. Morrison had dismissed her report without investigation. The fire chief inspected that vehicle last month and found no problems, he'd said, waving away her documentation. I think you're seeing issues that don't exist because you want to feel important. Pierce had gone further, suggesting in a staff meeting that Cass might be creating problems to justify her position because she felt threatened by Rodriguez's arrival. The accusation had been devastating, not just professionally but personally, questioning her integrity as well as her competence. When Cass had persisted, providing additional technical documentation and even photographs of the faulty components, Morrison had lost his temper completely. "You're a mechanic, not an engineer," he'd shouted in front of the entire maintenance staff. "Your job is to fix what you're told to fix, not to invent problems that don't exist." The confrontation had attracted attention from other airport employees, creating exactly the kind of scene that Cass had spent 10 years trying to avoid. But her military training, the same training that had taught her to identify potential failures before they became catastrophic, wouldn't let her ignore a safety issue that could cost lives. She'd been right. Of course. The vehicle had failed spectacularly during a training exercise the following week, covering the fire chief and 2 volunteers in chemical foam that should have been directed at a simulated aircraft fire. No one was seriously injured, but the embarrassment had been significant enough to require explanations to the Federal Aviation Administration and the airport's insurance company. Morrison's response had been to blame Cass for not being more aggressive in her original report, while simultaneously restricting her access to safety-critical systems to prevent future confusion about maintenance priorities. Pierce had supported the restrictions, arguing that Cass's confrontational approach to safety issues was creating unnecessary tension in the workplace. The isolation had become almost complete after that incident. Other maintenance staff, intimidated by management's obvious hostility toward Cass, had begun excluding her from informal discussions and social interactions. Her technical expertise, which had once made her valuable to colleagues seeking advice, was now seen as a liability that could attract unwanted attention from supervisors. Rodriguez, sensing the political winds, had stopped asking Cass for guidance on complex repairs. Her insights during safety briefings were met with uncomfortable silence. Even Jack Brennan, the head of maintenance who had once praised her skills, had begun assigning her routine tasks that kept her away from critical systems and high visibility projects. The message was clear: conform, stay quiet, and accept your place, or face escalating consequences that could threaten your livelihood. For someone who had once been responsible for mission-critical decisions involving million-dollar aircraft and human lives, the forced insignificance was almost unbearable. But Cass had endured it, telling herself that keeping her job was more important than defending her dignity. She'd learned to swallow corrections from people who knew a fraction of what she did about aviation. She'd accepted blame for problems she'd tried to prevent and credit for successes she'd made possible through knowledge she couldn't acknowledge. Until today. Until Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Ghost Patterson's desperate voice crackled through that emergency radio, and every instinct she'd spent 10 years suppressing suddenly demanded to be heard. Standing in that control tower, watching Morrison fumble with procedures she could execute in her sleep, Cass realized that some situations were too important for politics, too urgent for workplace hierarchies, and too dangerous for the kind of institutional cowardice that had defined her life since leaving the Navy. The F-22 was still falling. A pilot's life hung in the balance. And for the first time in a decade, Captain Cassandra Phoenix Reynolds was about to remember what it felt like to put mission before self-preservation. The emergency alarm pierced through Ridgefield Regional Airport at 14:27 Mountain Time, its shrill tone cutting across the afternoon calm like a blade. Cass had been underneath a Cessna 172 in Hangar B, replacing a worn brake line when the sound froze every person on the airport grounds. 3 long blasts meant aircraft in distress, the kind of emergency that tested everything an airport claimed to know about crisis management. She'd rolled out from under the aircraft and was wiping her hands on a shop rag when her radio crackled with fragmented transmissions from the control tower. Through the static and overlapping voices, she caught pieces of information that made her blood run cold. F-22 Raptor. Complete system failure. Military pilot requesting emergency landing assistance. ... Double quotes. By the time she'd climbed the stairs to the control tower, the scene was already deteriorating into barely controlled chaos. Morrison stood at the primary radio console, his face flushed and sweating as he fumbled through emergency protocol checklists that were clearly unfamiliar to him. Pierce paced behind him, barking orders to junior staff who scrambled between different communication stations with expressions of mounting panic. "Where's the military liaison manual?" Pierce shouted to no one in particular. "We're supposed to have special procedures for military aircraft emergencies." "I can't find it." called back one of the junior controllers. The filing system was reorganized last month, and nothing's where it's supposed to be. The radar screen showed a rapidly descending blip over the mountainous terrain northwest of the airport, while automated warning systems flashed red indicators that nobody seemed to fully understand. Ghost's voice continued to crackle through the emergency frequency, each transmission more desperate than the last as his aircraft's condition deteriorated. Ridgefield Tower. This is Ghost. I'm at 10,000 feet and falling fast. I need immediate vectors to the nearest suitable runway. My aircraft is not responding to control inputs, and I'm running out of time. Morrison keyed his microphone with shaking hands. Ghost, this is Ridgefield Tower. We're consulting our charts to find the best option for you. Can you maintain your current heading? The response came back sharp with frustration. Negative, Ridgefield. I have no control over heading, altitude, or airspeed. This aircraft is flying itself into the ground, and I need options now, not later. That's when Frank Kellerman, the airport manager, burst through the control tower door with his cell phone pressed to his ear and panic written across his face. Behind him trailed two federal aviation inspectors who had been conducting a routine safety audit when the emergency began. What's the situation? Kellerman demanded, ending his call abruptly. I've got reporters already calling about a military aircraft in distress over civilian airspace. This is exactly the kind of publicity nightmare we can't afford, especially with the FAA here for inspection. One of the inspectors, a stern-faced woman named Beverly Crawford, immediately moved to observe Morrison's handling of the emergency. Her presence added another layer of pressure to an already volatile situation, as everyone in the tower became acutely aware that their performance was being evaluated by the very agency that controlled their operating licenses. Standard protocol for military aircraft emergencies requires immediate coordination with NORAD and the nearest Air Force installation, Crawford announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. Have those notifications been made? Morrison's face went pale. We're working on establishing those contacts now. Working on it? Crawford's eyebrows rose dangerously. This aircraft has been in distress for over 4 minutes. Those contacts should have been established within 60 seconds of initial contact. The criticism sent Morrison into a spiral of increasingly frantic activity. He began making rapid radio calls to various agencies, but his nervousness caused him to mangle call signs, confuse frequencies, and provide incorrect information that created more confusion rather than clarity. Each mistake drew sharper looks from Crawford and more agitated pacing from Kellerman. Meanwhile, Ghost's transmissions were becoming increasingly urgent. Ridgefield Tower. I'm at 7,000 feet and descending through 500 feet per minute. I need landing options immediately, or I'm ejecting in 30 seconds. There are camping areas and hiking trails throughout these mountains. I cannot risk civilian casualties by staying with this aircraft much longer. Pierce had taken over a secondary radio console and was attempting to contact Peterson Air Force Base, but her lack of familiarity with military communication protocols was obvious. She kept using incorrect terminology and failing to provide essential information that military coordinators needed to assist with the emergency. Peterson Base. This is Ridgefield Regional Airport. We have a plane it's one of yours, I think. An F-22. The pilot says he's going to jump out. The response from Peterson was immediate and professional, but frustrated. Ridgefield Regional, this is Peterson Air Force Base Emergency Operations. We need precise coordinates, aircraft status, pilot condition, and your available runway specifications. Can you provide that information? Pierce looked helplessly at the papers scattered across her console. We're still gathering that information. The situation reached its breaking point when Crawford stepped forward and firmly moved Morrison aside from the primary radio console. "This is completely unacceptable," she announced to the room. "I'm observing multiple violations of emergency response protocols, inadequate coordination with military authorities, and a fundamental lack of preparedness for this type of incident." Kellerman's face turned ashen as he realized the implications. A failed emergency response during an FAA inspection could result in the airport losing its operating certificate, effectively shutting down the facility that employed half the people in Ridgefield and served as the economic backbone of the community. "Ma'am, please," Kellerman pleaded with Crawford. "Our staff are doing their best under extraordinary circumstances. We rarely see military aircraft here, and an F-22 emergency is unprecedented for a facility of our size. That's precisely the problem." Crawford replied coldly. "Emergency preparedness isn't about handling routine situations. It's about being ready for the unexpected. And what I'm seeing here suggests a dangerous level of unpreparedness that puts both pilots and civilians at risk." As the recriminations flew around the control tower, Ghost's voice cut through the arguments with deadly urgency. Any station, this is Air Force emergency frequency. I am at 5,000 feet and descending rapidly. I have approximately 15 seconds to make a decision about ejection. If anyone can provide me with landing options, I need them now." The control tower fell silent as everyone realized they were about to witness a catastrophe. A $150 million aircraft was about to be lost. An elite pilot was seconds away from ejecting into dangerous terrain, and their complete failure to provide assistance was being documented by federal inspectors who could destroy their careers with a single report. Morrison made one last desperate attempt, his voice cracking as he keyed the microphone. "Ghost, we're still calculating your best options. Can you hold on just a few more minutes?" The response was flat, professional, and final. "Negative, Ridgefield. I'm out of time. Ejecting in 10 seconds. I'm sorry we couldn't make this work." That's when Cass Reynolds stepped forward, her weathered hand reaching for the microphone with a confidence that seemed to transform the very air in the control tower. Every eye in the room turned to her as she moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had handled life-or-death emergencies when failure wasn't an option. "Ghost, hold your ejection." Her voice carried across the emergency frequency with the calm authority of a pilot who had talked others through impossible situations. "This is Phoenix. I have your solution." The silence that followed was profound and electric. Morrison's mouth opened in shock. Pierce stopped pacing mid-step. Even Crawford, the unflappable federal inspector, stared at the grease-stained mechanic who had just used a military call sign with the casual confidence of someone who belonged on that frequency. But it was Ghost's response that changed everything, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise, hope, and professional recognition that cut through 10 years of carefully maintained anonymity. "Phoenix? Phoenix, is that really you? Jesus Christ, where have you been?" In that moment, as every person in the control tower realized they were listening to something extraordinary, Cassandra Phoenix Reynolds made the choice that would shatter the quiet life she'd built and force her to become, once again, the pilot she'd never stopped being. The F-22 was at 3,000 feet and falling. A pilot's life hung in the balance. And Captain Cassandra Reynolds was about to remember what it felt like to save someone without asking permission first. The moment Phoenix's voice filled the control tower, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere. The chaos that had defined the emergency response suddenly crystallized into focused purpose as Cass moved to the primary radio console with the fluid efficiency of someone returning to their natural element. "Ghost, Phoenix here. I need your current altitude, rate of descent, and remaining fuel status." Her voice carried the calm precision that had once guided damaged aircraft through storms and combat zones. The grease-stained coveralls and weathered hands seemed inconsequential now. What mattered was the unmistakable authority in her tone. "Phoenix, altitude 2,800 feet and falling at 800 feet per minute. Fuel remaining approximately 12 minutes, but that's academic since I have no engine control. All flight surfaces are unresponsive, and I'm flying a very expensive glider right now. Ghost's relief was audible even through the static. I can't believe it's actually you. Command told us you'd disappeared completely. Morrison, Pierce, and the others watched in stunned silence as Cass spread a sectional chart across the console with movements that spoke of thousands of hours spent in similar situations. Her fingers traced topographical lines with the muscle memory of someone who had navigated by these charts when GPS systems failed and radio beacons went dosed. I need you to listen carefully. You're currently over Elk Ridge. Bearing 180 degrees from your position is Cascade Valley Strip runway 0927. 9,500 feet of concrete with clear approaches from both directions. It's an old military training facility, built for heavy aircraft operations. Beverly Crawford, the FAA inspector, stepped closer with obvious fascination. She'd seen hundreds of emergency responses throughout her career, but never anything like this transformation. The woman who moments ago had been dismissed as maintenance staff was now coordinating a military aircraft emergency with expertise that seemed to exceed anyone else in the room. How do you know about that airfield? Crawford asked quietly, more curious than accusatory. Cascade Valley isn't on any of our current operational charts. Cass didn't look up from her calculations, but her answer carried the weight of professional knowledge that couldn't be faked. It was decommissioned from active military use in 2003, but maintained for emergency operations. The runway surface was resurfaced in 2019 as part of a Department of Defense contingency preparedness program. It's perfect for what we need. Frank Kellerman had stopped his agitated pacing and was staring at his employee, the woman he'd considered just another mechanic, with growing amazement. How could you possibly know details like that? But Cass was already moving to the next phase, her hands working across multiple radio frequencies with practiced ease. Peterson Base, this is Phoenix. Coordinating emergency landing for F-22 tail number 054098. Directing the aircraft to Cascade Valley Strip. Request immediate activation of emergency services and standby for medical support. The response from Peterson was immediate and professional. Phoenix, this is Peterson Emergency Operations. Cascade Valley is not currently active. How do you confirm runway status and emergency service availability? Peterson, I've personally inspected that facility within the last 18 months. Runway is clear, lighting system operational, and fire suppression equipment is maintained in ready status. I'm taking full responsibility for this recommendation. Crawford's eyes widened. You've inspected it? Under what authority? For the first time since taking control, Cass hesitated. Admitting the truth meant revealing not just her military background, but the fact that she'd maintained security clearances and conducted unofficial assessments of emergency facilities throughout the region, activities that went far beyond her official job description. I maintain informal oversight of regional emergency aviation resources, she said carefully, then immediately refocused on the crisis. Ghost, I'm transmitting heading and approach data now. You'll need to configure for a dead stick landing with no go-around capability. As she worked, muscle memory took over completely. Her hands moved across radio controls and navigation equipment with the unconscious precision of someone who had done this thousands of times before. She pulled out sectional charts that showed details most civilian controllers never accessed, referenced approach plates for facilities that weren't supposed to exist in civilian databases, and coordinated with military frequencies that required security clearances too. Monitor. Morrison and Pierce watched in growing bewilderment as their supposedly subordinate employee demonstrated expertise that made their own training look elementary. Every technical term, every procedural reference, every coordination protocol was executed with flawless precision. Phoenix, I'm beginning my approach to Cascade Valley now. Ghost's voice carried renewed confidence. I have the runway in sight. Configuration looks exactly as you described. How did you know all those details? The question hung in the air as everyone in the control tower waited for an answer that would explain the impossible. How did a maintenance worker know classified details about decommissioned military facilities? How could someone who fixed landing gear coordinate emergency responses with the authority of a seasoned air traffic controller? Cass keyed the microphone, and for just a moment, her professional mask slipped to reveal something deeper. Because I used to land aircraft like yours on runways like that. And I never forgot how to bring pilots home. The admission sent ripples through the control tower. Crawford pulled out her phone and began what appeared to be urgent text messages to superiors. Kellerman stared at his employee with the expression of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew. Even the junior controllers had stopped their tasks to focus entirely on the unfolding drama. But Cass had already moved past the personal revelation. Her attention focused entirely on Ghost's approach. She'd activated additional radio frequencies to coordinate with emergency services, contacted the facility maintenance team at Cascade Valley to confirm runway status, and established communication protocols with Peterson Air Force Base for post-landing procedures. Ghost, you're 3 miles out on final approach. Runway is clear. Emergency services are standing by. Remember, you're landing dead stick with no hydraulics, so plan for maximum rollout distance. The runway has 3,000 feet of overrun on each end if you need it. Copy that, Phoenix. Approaching runway threshold now. It feels good to have someone talking me down who knows what they're doing. The control tower had become eerily quiet except for the radio chatter. Between Phoenix and Ghost, Morrison stood off to one side. His earlier authority completely evaporated as everyone recognized the vast difference between bureaucratic protocol and actual expertise. Pierce had stopped making suggestions entirely, seemingly overwhelmed by the depth of knowledge being displayed by someone she'd dismissed as unqualified. Phoenix, I want you to know, Ghost's voice carried a note of personal gratitude that transcended the professional exchange. When they told us you'd left the service, a lot of us wondered what really happened. Seeing you here, doing this, it's like finding a piece of the old squadron again. The comment hit Cass harder than she'd expected. For 10 years, she'd convinced herself that her military identity was something she'd successfully left behind. But hearing Ghost's voice, coordinating this emergency, feeling the familiar rhythm of life or death decision-making, it was like discovering a part of herself she'd thought was dead. Just concentrate on your landing. Ghost, we can catch up on old times after you're safely on the ground. As the F-22 approached touchdown, every person in the control tower held their breath. The success or failure of the landing would determine not just Ghost's survival, but the future of everyone who had witnessed this extraordinary transformation. Beverly Crawford would file reports that could change careers. Frank Kellerman would have to decide what to do with an employee whose real qualifications apparently far exceeded her job description, but for Cassandra Phoenix Reynolds, the approaching moment of truth represented something far more significant. The end of a decade-long lie and the beginning of whatever came after. The world discovered who she really was. The F-22 touched down on Cascade Valley's runway with a precision that spoke to both Ghost's skill and Phoenix's guidance. And as the aircraft rolled safely to a stop, everyone in that control tower knew they had just witnessed something they would never forget. The control tower erupted into controlled chaos as Ghost's successful landing sent ripples of relief through everyone present. But the celebration was short-lived as the full implications of what they'd witnessed began to sink in. Beverly Crawford was already on her phone with FOA headquarters, her voice urgent as she described the extraordinary circumstances of the emergency response. Yes, sir. I understand this is highly unusual. Crawford spoke into her phone while maintaining eye contact with Cass. But I'm telling you, We just witnessed the most professionally executed emergency coordination I've seen in 23 years of aviation safety inspection. And it was conducted by someone who's supposedly employed here as aircraft maintenance. Frank Kellerman stood frozen near the window, watching emergency vehicles race toward Cascade Valley Strip in the distance. His mind was racing through the implications: insurance liability, regulatory compliance, media attention, and most pressingly, what to do about an employee who had just revealed herself to be far more than she'd ever claimed to be. Morrison and Pierce huddled together near the secondary radio console. Their earlier authority completely evaporated as they processed their public failure alongside someone's spectacular success. The contrast was devastating. They'd fumbled through basic emergency protocols while their supposed subordinate had coordinated a military aircraft emergency with the expertise of a seasoned air traffic controller. But it was the voice that crackled through the emergency frequency that changed everything. Ridgefield Tower. This is General Patricia Hayes, commander of Peterson Air Force Base. I need to speak immediately with the individual who coordinated this emergency landing. I believe she identified herself as Phoenix. The silence in the control tower was absolute. A general, a two-star general, was asking to speak directly with their mechanic. Crawford's phone conversation stopped mid-sentence as she stared at the radio console. Even Kellerman's business concerns seemed trivial compared to the realization that they were dealing with someone important, enough to command the attention of senior military leadership. Cass hesitated for just a moment, her hand hovering over the microphone. Taking that call would mean crossing a line she'd spent 10 years avoiding acknowledging. Her military identity in front of civilian colleagues who would never look at her the same way again. "This is Phoenix," she said finally, her voice carrying the formal precision of military protocol. "Phoenix, this is General Hayes. First, let me commend you on an outstanding emergency coordination. Your knowledge of regional facilities and ability to direct our pilot to a suitable landing site potentially saved both a valuable aircraft and an irreplaceable pilot." Crawford had put her phone away entirely, now openly recording the conversation on her device. This was no longer just an FAA inspection incident. This was something that would require detailed documentation and probably congressional briefings. However, General Hayes continued, her tone shifting to something more personal. "I'm looking at personnel files that show Captain Cassandra Reynolds, call sign Phoenix, resigned from active duty 10 years ago. The pilot you just saved, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, served under your command during Operation Desert Shield. I think we need to have a conversation." The revelation hit the control tower like a physical blow. Morrison's face went pale as he realized he'd been dismissing and humiliating a former military captain. Pierce actually took a step backward, as if physical distance could somehow protect her from the consequences of her behavior towards someone who outranked half the officers at Peterson Air Force Base. But Cass was already responding, her military bearing fully emerged now. "General Hayes, I'm no longer active duty. My current employment is civilian maintenance at Ridgefield Regional Airport. I acted today in my capacity as someone who couldn't stand by and watch a pilot die when I had the knowledge to help. Captain Reynolds, and yes, I'm using your rank because resignation doesn't erase 8 years of distinguished service. We need to discuss your current situation. Are you available for immediate transport to Peterson for debriefing?" Before Cass could respond, Crawford stepped forward. "General Hayes, this is Inspector Beverly Crawford. I'm conducting an official safety inspection at this facility, and I need to advise you that Captain Reynolds," she stumbled slightly over the rank, "has been employed here under circumstances that may involve regulatory violations." The response was swift and decisive. "Inspector Crawford, I appreciate the FAA has concerns, but Captain Reynolds has just demonstrated exceptional expertise in a life-threatening emergency. Any regulatory questions can be addressed through proper military-civilian liaison channels. Right now I need to debrief the officer who saved one of my pilots. Kellerman finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Captain Reynolds? You were a military officer? Cass turned to face her employer, the man who had paid her mechanics wages while she'd hidden qualifications that exceeded those of most people in aviation. The gulf between who she'd pretended to be and who she really was seemed impossible to bridge with simple explanations. I was Captain Cassandra Reynolds, United States Navy, naval flight officer with Top Gun certification and over 2,000 hours in high-performance military aircraft, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the revelation. I resigned my commission 10 years ago for personal reasons and chose to work in civilian aviation maintenance. Pierce's voice came out as a croak. Top Gun? You were a Top Gun pilot? Naval flight officer, Cass corrected automatically. And yes, I graduated second in my class from the United States Navy Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program. The admission sent another wave of shock through the room. Morrison looked like he might be physically ill as he processed the months of condescension and dismissal he directed toward someone whose military credentials were impeccable. General Hayes's voice cut through their shock. Captain Reynolds, I'm sending a transport helicopter to retrieve you for immediate consultation. We have several questions about how you acquired detailed knowledge of classified emergency facilities, and frankly, we could use your expertise on a permanent basis. Crawford interjected again. General, I need to advise that there may be federal regulations regarding undisclosed military personnel working in civilian aviation facilities. Inspector Crawford, the general's tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to ending discussions. Captain Reynolds is not undisclosed military personnel. She's a distinguished former officer who chose civilian employment and happened to be in the right place at the right time to save lives. The Air Force considers this a successful emergency response, not a regulatory violation, as if to emphasize the point. Ghost's voice joined the frequency. General Hayes, this is Patterson. Phoenix didn't just save my aircraft, she saved my life. Whatever questions anyone has about her qualifications, I can tell you that her emergency coordination was flawless. She knew that landing site better than our own intelligence files did. The comment sparked another realization in Crawford's expression. Captain Reynolds, how did you have such detailed knowledge of that facility? You mentioned conducting inspections. Under what authority? Cass looked around the control tower at faces that ranged from shock to admiration to barely controlled panic. There was no going back now, no way to retreat into the anonymity she'd cultivated so carefully. Every word she spoke was digging her deeper into a truth she'd spent a decade avoiding. I maintain security clearances through the Department of Defense Reserve Program, she admitted finally. I've been conducting informal assessments of regional emergency aviation resources as part of civilian preparedness initiatives. It was my way of staying connected to the mission without being officially active. The silence that followed was profound. Everyone in the room understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just the revelation of hidden identity, but the emergence of someone whose dedication to service had never really ended. Even when she'd walked away from everything that had once defined her life, General Hayes's voice carried a note of respect that made her next words sound more like a request than an order. Captain Reynolds, I think it's time you came home. The Air Force could use officers with your experience and dedication. What do you say? As Cass stood in that control tower, surrounded by people whose entire perception of her had been shattered in the space of 30 minutes, she realized that the choice she'd made 10 years ago to disappear, to hide, to live small had finally run its course. The woman who had once been Phoenix was about to decide whether she was ready to rise again. 3 months after the F-22 emergency that changed everything, Cassandra Phoenix Reynolds stood in the same control tower at Ridgefield Regional Airport, but nothing else remained the same. The grease-stained coveralls had been replaced by a crisp Air Force uniform bearing the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel, a promotion that recognized both her previous service and her new role as Regional Emergency Aviation Coordinator for the Mountain West. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been without complications. The weeks following Ghost's emergency landing had been a whirlwind of debriefings, security clearance updates, and difficult conversations about the future. General Hayes had been persistent in her recruitment efforts, but Phoenix had negotiated something unprecedented, a hybrid position that allowed her to serve both military and civilian aviation communities. "It's the most creative personnel arrangement I've seen in 30 years, General Hayes had told Pentagon officials during the approval process. But Captain Reynolds, Colonel Reynolds, now has proven she can save lives from any position. We're adapting our structure to accommodate her unique value to aviation safety." The arrangement meant Phoenix split her time between Peterson Air Force Base, where she consulted on emergency response protocols, and Ridgefield Regional, where she'd established the first civilian military aviation emergency coordination center in the Rocky Mountain region. The small airport that had once dismissed her expertise was now a model for integrated emergency response that was being studied by aviation authorities nationwide. Beverly Crawford had returned twice since the emergency, but her role had shifted from inspector to consultant. The FAA had been so impressed with the emergency response coordination that they'd asked Phoenix to help design new protocols for civilian airports handling military aircraft emergencies. The regulatory violations that Crawford had initially worried about had been transformed into commendations for innovative problem solving. Colonel Reynolds represents exactly the kind of creative thinking we need in modern aviation safety, Crawford had written in her final report. Her ability to bridge military and civilian aviation protocols could revolutionize how we handle complex emergencies. The changes at Ridgefield Regional had been equally dramatic. Frank Kellerman had struggled initially with the revelation about his employee's true background, torn between embarrassment at having underutilized her talents and pride at having someone of her caliber associated with his facility. "I keep thinking about all the times I dismissed her suggestions or treated her like just another mechanic," Kellerman confided to his wife during one of their evening walks. "She could have been running this place, and instead I had her changing oil and fixing landing gear." The guilt had motivated him to make amends in concrete ways. Phoenix's new position came with a private office, administrative support, and a budget for emergency equipment that rivaled small military installations. More importantly, Kellerman had instituted new policies ensuring that all employees' suggestions were heard regardless of their official job titles. Jake Morrison and Janet Pierce had faced the most difficult reckonings. Morrison had requested a transfer to a different facility within a week of the emergency, unable to face the daily reminder of how spectacularly he'd failed when it mattered most. His final day had been awkward and painful, marked by an apology to Phoenix that felt inadequate for the months of condescension and harassment. "I don't know how to make up for how I treated you," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I knew what expertise looked like, and I was completely wrong." Pierce had made a different choice, staying at Ridgefield and requesting to work directly with Phoenix on emergency protocols. The transformation had been remarkable. Her earlier jealousy and hostility replaced by genuine respect and a desire to learn from someone whose capabilities she finally understood. "She's teaching me things about aviation that I never learned in 15 years of flight coordination," Pierce had told other staff members. "I realize now that I was so focused on defending my territory that I missed the opportunity to learn from someone extraordinary." The relationship between Phoenix and Pierce had evolved into something resembling mentorship, though both women were careful not to dwell too heavily on their previous conflicts. Phoenix had instituted monthly training sessions where she shared insights from military aviation that helped civilian controllers handle unusual situations with greater confidence. Tommy Rodriguez, the young mechanic who had briefly been management's preferred employee, had become one of Phoenix's most dedicated students. Her willingness to share knowledge freely, combined with her practical approach to teaching, had accelerated his development far beyond what traditional training programs could have achieved. Working with Colonel Reynolds is like having a masterclass in aviation every day, Rodriguez often told his friends. She doesn't just show you how to fix things, she explains why systems work the way they do, and how to anticipate problems before they happen. The ripple effects extended far beyond Ridgefield Regional. Military aviation commands across the country had begun implementing Phoenix's emergency coordination protocols, while civilian airports were adopting her integrated approach to crisis management. Aviation safety journals had published 3 articles about the Reynolds method of emergency response, and she'd been invited to speak at conferences from Seattle to Miami. But perhaps the most significant change was in Phoenix herself. The woman who had spent 10 years hiding her capabilities now embraced opportunities to share her expertise. The fear of judgment that had kept her silent for a decade had been replaced by a renewed sense of mission, not just to fly or to serve, but to ensure that her knowledge could prevent other emergencies from becoming tragedies. I spent so long worried about what would happen if people knew who I really was, she'd confided to Ghost during one of his visits to Ridgefield. I never considered that hiding my abilities might mean someone else would suffer for my silence. Ghost had been among her most frequent visitors, using cross-country flights as excuses to check on the pilot who had once been his commanding officer. Their conversations often stretched late into the evening, processing not just the emergency that had reunited them, but the decade of separation that had preceded it. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Ghost had said during his most recent visit. "How many other people are out there, hiding what they're capable of because they're afraid of being judged or rejected? How much talent is wasted because people don't think they're allowed to be extraordinary?" The observation had sparked Phoenix's newest project, a program to identify and develop hidden expertise within civilian aviation communities. Working with both military and civilian authorities, she was creating pathways for people with unusual backgrounds or underdeveloped skills to contribute meaningfully to aviation safety and operations. Program had already identified 12 individuals across the region whose capabilities exceeded their current positions. Former military personnel working in unrelated fields, civilian pilots with advanced technical knowledge, and aviation enthusiasts whose insights could enhance professional operations. Every person has hidden depths, Phoenix often told the mixed civilian-military audiences at her speaking engagements. The challenge isn't finding extraordinary people, it's creating environments where ordinary people feel safe enough to reveal the extraordinary things they're capable of. The message resonated far beyond aviation circles. Business leaders, educators, and community organizers had begun adapting Phoenix's insights to their own challenges, creating cultures where hidden talents could emerge and contribute without fear of judgment or retaliation. As Phoenix looked out over the runways of Ridgefield Regional on this crisp autumn afternoon, watching aircraft take off and land with the smooth precision that spoke of excellent coordination between towers and pilots, she reflected on the journey that had brought her full circle. 10 years ago, she'd chosen to disappear rather than fight a system that had punished her for choosing compassion over protocol. The choice had cost her a decade of meaningful contribution, but it had also taught her lessons about resilience, humility, and the courage required to live authentically despite external pressures. The woman who had once been afraid to speak up in safety meetings now briefed generals and airline executives on crisis management. The mechanic who had been dismissed as unqualified now designed training programs used by military installations across 3 continents. But most importantly, Captain now Colonel Cassandra Phoenix Reynolds had learned that some secrets are too important to keep, some talents too valuable to hide, and some missions too critical to abandon simply because the cost of serving seems too high to bear. Here in America, we sometimes forget that extraordinary people walk among us every day, disguised as ordinary workers, quiet neighbors, and unremarkable colleagues. They're the veterans bagging groceries who once led soldiers through impossible missions. They're the substitute teachers with advanced degrees working for a fraction of their worth. They're the maintenance workers who understand complex systems better than the engineers who designed them. Phoenix's story reminds us that everyone deserves the chance to contribute their best capabilities, regardless of how those abilities were acquired or why they've been hidden. Sometimes the most valuable expertise comes from people who've learned to survive in the shadows, and sometimes the greatest service comes from those who choose to emerge from hiding when lives depend on their courage. What would you have done in Phoenix's situation? Would you have revealed your abilities earlier, or would you have protected your privacy even when someone's life hung in the balance? And more importantly, what hidden capabilities are you carrying that could make a difference if you found the courage to share them? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story inspired you to think differently about the people around you or about your own unrevealed potential, don't forget to subscribe for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the moment demands their very best. After all, you never know when the world might need your own version of Phoenix to rise from the ashes and remind everyone what's possible when courage meets opportunity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.